West Virginia, Kimberly has held key roles at Northeast Natural Energy, Inflection Energy, Lola Energy, and Beach Resources. In 2017, she founded Ayers Petroleum Consulting, which is based in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania. Kimberly holds a Master's of Science in Petroleum and Natural Gas Engineering from West Virginia University and a dual bachelor's in Mathematics and Chemistry from West Virginia Wesleyan College. An active Society of Petroleum Engineers member, she previously served as chairman of the Pittsburgh section. In 2024, she became a certified mineral appraiser, enhancing her ability to serve a diverse client base across the region. So now I'll hand it off to Kimberly for her presentation titled Engineering Insights for Landmen.
Thanks for the introduction, John. I'm looking forward to this. I wanted to also let the audience know that as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I do have my slides numbered, so if you want to refer to a certain slide and when we get to a specific section, John's going to ping in and read your questions to me, and then we can talk about those. And then at the end, I am willing to stay around and chat with anyone with the last section there. So yeah, let's dive right into this. The term data-driven is being very highly used in the world today with artificial intelligence. However, I would say that our industry and specifically has always been data-driven. As an engineer, I love data. I love to look at it different ways. I love to make plans and optimize. But I also realize that us as engineers need to do a better job at communicating with other groups that participate in the industry. Hence this conversation with you guys. I want to give you a little piece of how we engineers think about developing our oil and gas resources, how us engineers communicate those complicated numbers to the wider audience, to the stakeholders, and then give you a little insight into how we make those decisions as engineers. So this is not about AI. This is about how we leverage information that's available to all of us publicly to make better decisions, to grow our businesses, to grow the industry, and to sustainably develop this lovely resource we have up here in the Appalachian Basin. All right, let's jump into it. John gave you a wonderful intro on my background. I wanted to add one little thing, color item for you guys. I am third generation. I was taught how to abstract by the nice ladies at the Kanawha County Courthouse in Charleston when I was 16 years old. So my dad used to let me go out and take leases and right-of-ways and try to construct title on my own for conventional vertical wells that were drilled in the 70s and 80s. So that was really my first introduction to the oil and gas business. I didn't know you could be an engineer. I knew some geologists. So as I was finishing my schooling, the Marcellus was starting to ramp up, and I was like, I want to do the math behind this industry and really understand the economics. And because I grew up with my family's business, drilling some conventional wells, doing the land work with my dad, building pipelines, I really loved this central role of being a reserves or reservoir engineer. We use those terms interchangeably. And I just love being in this planning space, which also turns into the valuations of those companies. Additionally, I wanted to mention that my team is mostly engineers. We have some technicians, but we have engineers and technicians. We're scattered across the basin. Everyone's remote, and we're serving companies up here. We're specific to the basin. We will do some appraisal work outside of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, sometimes New York. But we really like being the specialists up here and helping all of the mid-sized companies, typically and smaller, and mineral buyers, owners, sellers. Yeah, it's a great basin up here. We're proud to be a part of it. All right, our topics today, specifically, I want to walk you guys through what's the difference between a fair market value mineral appraisal and a reserve report. That's something you're going to run into a lot if you're talking to engineers about the value of various properties or projects. I want to talk to you about the public data that we have available in the basin from the engineering standpoint. what us engineers look like, what we think about production, where we go, which then feeds how operators are thinking about developing, how those leases and those minerals and those groups of assets are being high graded, how the sticks are getting laid out. Interestingly, these three topics, from my perspective, you could approach them from any angle, and they all are in a continuous feedback loop. The more information we have publicly about well performance, that informs our type wells we're developing in our reserve reports and mineral appraisals. And then the strategic development plans of the operators is then affecting what's in the public data, et cetera. These go all different directions. And it's a continuous learning process, which is really fun. A big part of this conversation day will be showing you guys how the basin's changed and matured over time, how we've gotten better with technology, and we're getting more gas out of the ground. So I chose in these three topics to go with what may be perceived the most boring topic for non-engineers first, and that would be the documentation of our engineering work. So I'm going to talk about that first. At that point, I'll pause, take questions that you might have in the chat. Then we'll go over the App Basin database, bunch of pretty pictures for you guys. And then the last topic will be the development planning. And this, again, it will be from my perspective, working with operators in-house and as a consultant when they put together their plans. And that's where I hope to have a little bit of interaction with you guys, answer your questions. Again, this is going to be my opinion, but I feel like I have a pretty good insight as to how operators are choosing where to drill next. All right, let's jump into it. All right, reserve reports and mineral appraisals. Of course, we got to start with the what, where, when, how, who question list, right? I get asked this question all the time. Most people refer to an engineer's report in our industry as a reserves report. That is typically what they're thinking. A mineral appraisal is a less commonly used term, but they are two very separate things that we'll go into. And we really have to start with what is the purpose of the report that's being requested or that's being used for some purpose by a company for a plan, for financing, et cetera. The purpose really helps you pick which one you need. The intended user is also very important, whether that be really who's requesting that and who it's going to, or the purpose of the report in general will influence who the user is as well. And then the category of value to be assigned. It's not something we normally think about. We always think something as it is worth this particular number. The category of value depends on what your perspective is, what your timeline is, and again, what the purpose is. That purpose really waterfalls down into all of the subsequent questions. So I'm going to go to the worst slide of the entire presentation. I promise you, this is the only chart with a lot of words that I put in this entire presentation. I'm an engineer, I had to do it. At least it's not all numbers, right? So really, when comparing between a reserves report and a mineral appraisal is, are you trying to estimate recoverable hydrocarbons, the volumes, and then the dollar value of that? Or are you trying to estimate the fair market value of the mineral estate? And one note before we go too far, you'll hear me call a mineral appraisal an appraisal. You'll hear me call it a fair market value, an FMV. Those are all interchangeable terms for the fair market mineral appraisal. And then a reserves report, we always just typically call a reserves report. Sometimes you'll hear it called an engineering report in the industry. But really, if you're working mostly with operators or lenders, financial institutions, you're going to be looking at a reserves report. That report is generally prepared by a petroleum engineer or a team of engineers, and those engineers are taking input from the commercial team for pricing, the land team for validating NRIs and working interests. They're taking input from the geologists. They are taking input from the operations team for costs and the production team for operating expenses. So that is an aggregation of all of those different teams, put in with timelines, forecasts, that result in economics at the end. The primary method we use in a reserves report is a discounted cash flow method. And I did want to mention that we as engineers, we like to have rules. So both of these report styles have a very robust set of rules and guidelines we have to follow depending on what we're certifying under. So specifically with a reserves report, we operate under PRMS, which is the Petroleum Resource Management System that helps us define reserve categories and appropriate methods, and then also guidelines under SPWE's monographs. The governing bodies are SPE, SPEE, and the SEC. If a reserves report is being prepared for a publicly traded company, there are slightly different rules than the PRMS system. And those are something, if you're ever working with a company and you're trying to get a value for an asset, you need to be very clear if the report was prepared under PRMS or prepared under SEC guidelines. They're slightly different, but significantly, it can significantly affect the value. Now, talking about mineral appraisals, okay, we're halfway through this terrible slide. Mineral appraisals are generally used for owners, estate planners, tax authorities, and legal advisors. These are typically triggered annually for tax purposes for some type of event in the estate, such as a date of death, for some type of transaction. These generally have a trigger. Reserve reports almost always happen on a regular schedule, typically annually, sometimes twice a year, and they're typically ordered by operators. Mineral appraisals are typically ordered when something occurs. These should be completed by a certified mineral appraiser, and you can be certified as a geologist or an engineer, and you're certified based on your area of expertise. So I'm certified for oil and gas. I can't do coal. I do have some colleagues that are certified to do oil and gas and coal. They have undergraduate degrees in geology and different degrees in petroleum, so they can do both. Some geologists only do hard rocks. In the International Institute of Mineral Appraisers, there are specialists in gold and silver, etc. So mineral appraisals is a large umbrella. I'm only going to be speaking today about oil and gas because that's my specialization and your guys' too. We work under a bunch of different tax agencies, the IRS particularly for how we report, and USPAP is our guideline document. It tells us what has to be in the reports. And I'll generally say a reserves report, it runs in a text format of about 15 pages with a bunch of backup spreadsheets and graphs and economics. A mineral appraisal is about 80 pages of text because we have to state all of the rules and the hurdles, and you'll see when I go into detail here more about that. But the primary method in a mineral appraisal is more than discounted cash flow. We do that, but we also typically do comparable sales, like you would do on the surface in real estate, and we also do historic income. All right, we made it. We're going to talk a little bit more about reserves reports, then we'll talk about mineral appraisals, and then we're on to the fun, pretty pictures about data in the basin. All right, so the key elements of a reserves report. There's two different sections in this. It would be the technical review and the economic review. So in the technical, the engineers are spending a lot of time classifying wells or assets. In this case, in the case of a reserves report, we're looking at physical well bores or locations to be developed. So a PDP means proved developed producing. You'll hear that term all over the place when engineers are involved. That is a producing well as of the effective date. That means we can look at historical production and we can forecast that forward, and it typically doesn't have future capital expenses related to it. There's also PDNPs. These are slightly less valuable. These would be wells that have been or are capable of producing but are not currently producing. Example of this would be a well that is shut down for maintenance on a pipeline for a certain period of time. Or it could be a well that has been flowed back and not producing yet. So there's another bucket. And then the PUD bucket is proved undeveloped. These are future locations that we're confident within 90% of our economics that they will be developed under the conditions we lay out. So they're usually, when we're talking unconventionals, one horizontal spacing unit away from the producing well, maybe two on either side of a producer. So those top three buckets are what the SEC recognizes as reportable reserves. You sometimes see people producing on other categories called probable, possible, and contingent. Those just mean us engineers are less confident that we can forecast the amount of gas that will be, or oil, hydrocarbons that can be produced from that particular location. And how do we do this forecasting? So we do have to forecast all volumes. That would be oil, gas, NGL, water, carbon dioxide, any hydrogen, depending on some of the new stuff that's out there. We do forecast that using essentially a best fit method for curve fits. So we look at historical production, hang a curve off of it. It's called decline curve analysis, DCA. That's the primary method. There are whole classes on that topic, so I will spare you from that, but you have definitely seen a reservoir engineer's forecast before if you've been around the industry, with the volumes on the y-axis, the time on the x-axis, some little dots of production, and then a line curving off into the future. That's decline curve analysis. We also use some more advanced methods called RTA, that's rate transient analysis. We do what's called a type well when we don't have a long production history. We do that with public data. And then we look at, or well, not public data, we do that with aerial data. And we try to define wells that are analogies to the well we're trying to forecast. And then we do some aggregation, some statistics and math and say, we think this young well is going to produce like this because of what has happened around it. And in some cases, we use what's called volumetrics. That's usually in conventional cases. So there could be a whole 5 presentations on just that part of this slide, but I will keep moving. The economic considerations I have listed, we have to work with a bunch of different groups and stakeholders to really nail down the economic considerations in a reserves report. The one I did want to point out is abandonment liability. That is something that most operators do include in their reserves report, and it happens at the end of the life of the well. Some operators don't, and that's very, it can be concerning on the economics, especially if you're looking at a deal. So I wanted to bring that up to you guys as landman. If you're involved in deal flow, it's always a question of whether or not the abandonment is included in the economics or not, because it can really change the structure of a deal. All right, moving on to mineral appraisals. This is a little different here. I'm saying there's 2 kind of major sections of a mineral appraisal. One is technical, and then the other is how we approach the evaluation and reconcile it. So technically in a mineral appraisal, the work we're doing is really to determine the highest and best use of that asset. Typically that asset is a parcel or group of parcels owned by a certain group. And so we do a lot of work to make sure the deed is understood, the outline of the property is understood, how is it related to development? Is it an area that has been fully developed? There's sticks crossing it, laterals, conventionally completely drained or going to be. Is it partially developed? Is there orphan acreage that cannot be developed based on how the laterals were drilled? So we spend a lot of time trying to determine the spatial orientation of that parcel with the involved wells, calculating out the NRIs and the units or forecasting them in the case of undeveloped. And then making sure that we understand the scope of this. What is it for? Who needs it? Is this a tax issue? And then that effective date is very important. Because an appraisal for tax purposes is always dependent upon the date. So all of the approaches are cut off at that date. Recently, I've worked on several that were set back in 2014 for date of death appraisals, because the estate then has recently sold those parcels. And it's very interesting to roll all of our data back to 2014 and say, oh, well, this wasn't developed then. So the value is very different than it was 10 years ago than it is now. We also, based on the use PAP rules, we have to do a market review for pricing. We look at what development occurred, as I mentioned, and then we also look at the geology and say, yes, this is in a fairway, it is in a high likelihood of development area or not. So there's a lot of engineering and geology and strategy around really defining out strongly what that parcel's highest and best use is or will be in the future. The 6 approaches are prior sales, which typically we never use because that has to be sales on the exact property that we are reviewing. So I've actually never used it in oil and gas. And then we do sales comparison, which is very similar to what you would do in a real estate situation. You're looking at houses that are very similar to yours, adjusting them for a 2-car garage and a 1-car garage, and then looking at their sales. So we've got a specified time period, et cetera, and a radius that we're looking. We're making a lot of adjustments for the lease assumptions, et cetera. So sales comparisons usually huge. Risk adjusted discounted cash flow. That's our other primary method. That's for producing assets primarily or soon to be developed assets. Lease bonus is only if the property is undeveloped and we have good intel on leasing in the area. Cost basis, we typically do not do because we can't capture all of the costs that an operator may incur, especially in the unconventional. A landowner is not going to go out and drill a well on their own property and stand up a whole company. Back in the conventional days, it would be applicable, but not today. And then historic royalty income is our last approach. We look at if commodity prices were stable, and if the production profile was stable or declining, we can look to the past to forecast the future in a different manner than the discounted cash flow. All right, there's the 2 different ways us engineers try to value properties. Do we have any questions at this time? John, do you want to hop in? If anybody has questions, you can type them in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. We currently don't have any questions, but I have a question. So when we're looking at proved, developed, and producing, or when we were looking at the other terms, and if we're looking at a unit and an adjacent unit, which we expect to maybe be produced, how do you contemplate parent-child relationship, or how do you go through that thought process? Maybe
Yeah.
just speak on that a little bit, please.
Yeah. So I like to call that generational effects, parent to child. Operators are addressing that in a bunch of different ways, and I've actually done quite a few publications on the technical ways to handle that and what's happening with the production on those wells. So it's a favorite topic of mine. How we consider it in our undeveloped cases is that we make sure the type well we're developing includes both parents and children, so that we can see the potential degradation of offset locations. Additionally, we see operators outspacing their child wells a little bit more. So spacing is a big consideration in the total reserves calculation. If they're outspacing, that then means less likelihood of an interaction. So it's a little difficult to answer that question if I'm coming from a public perspective and I don't know what the operator's plan is, versus if I'm in-house with an operator and I know they're going to address that degradation problem, potential degradation or frac hits. And then additionally, I would say in general in the basin, we see parent wells getting frac hit and they'll generally go offline for 3 to 6 months. And then as soon as the child well's online and producing, the operator will bring them back on. And it usually takes 3 to 6 months for the parent well to clean itself up and come back to production. We almost always see the parent wells come back to their original forecast. They're neither better nor worse. Sometimes they're worse. Very rarely are they better, but most of the time within a year, they're back to where we expected them to be. Does that answer your question? There's a whole, again, we could do a whole nother presentation on that topic.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, do you see any, with regard to parent-child, is it pretty consistent across Marcellus and Utica? Or if we're producing wet gas versus dry gas or liquids, does that change the parent-child effect?
I haven't seen it strongly, but in general, in the US, us engineers are thinking that the wetter or the oily the play, the more effect it could have. Um, I don't see a huge effect in the dry gas areas, I'll put it that way, but you have more risk in the wetter areas.
Okay, very good. So Kimberly, we have a question. Um, so how do you account for unitization fluctuations in Appalachia or overlapping units?
That would that would be where I would work strongly with the land team because we have to define the NRI that's representative of the entity we're valuing, right? So if the units are overlapping, and it's two different operators, hopefully I have, or two different units of the same operator, I've got some type of statement where I'm not counting more than 100% of the pie. Or a lot of times I'm seeing with the unitization fluctuations, those are time stamped. So all of my reports are as of an effective date. So we have to assume whatever unit structure was effective as of that date. So I'm going to be working with the land team and the lawyers on that. But we can, if we're really unsure, we can run a sensitivity in both cases, right? So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, very, very good. And attendees, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat. But Kimberly, you mentioned insuring the abandonment liability if it's included in the potential cost outlay of a proposed unit. This may be more of an operations question, but do you have any estimation? Let's say it's not included. Do you have any best practices on a
Yeah,
financial outlook on what
yeah,
an
sure.
abandonment liability looks like?
Yeah, so the state of Ohio is publishing its data for abandoned wells. When it comes to vertical wells, their average is $40,000 to $50,000 per well in Ohio, and that's a general 4,000 to 5,000 foot well. That would be a good estimate for conventional vertical wells across the basin. Because you don't know what type of trouble you're going to get into, even if it's a shallower well. Unconventional horizontal wells, we're seeing between 75,000 and 125,000 to abandon those. It depends on the state, based on their rules and how much cement they want, basically, and how much surface reclamation you're gonna need gets rolled into that number.
Okay, no, that's great. Um, so let me ask you a question real quick. On the reserves report, I mean, let's say, is it common that a potential client of yours could be an owner of working interest or overriding royalty, and maybe they're soliciting offers for potential sale, and they come to you with a mix of producing overrides, undeveloped overrides, and you can kind of give them fair market estimation of what a good offer would look like?
So a fair market value is an appraisal. A reserves report is what it will be in the future. So that is, the answer is yes, but then we have to really be specific as to what the purpose is. So if it is for fair market on, if it is fair market to just sell the whole entity in a variety of ownerships, yes, we can handle overrides, developed, undeveloped, just royalty interest, working interest. You can blend that all into either report. But typically if there's a working interest involved or some type of cost bearing interest, we like to put that as a reserves report. And then we provide various present values, 10, 15, 20, and then recommend that they look at the market and see what those deals are selling at on a present value basis, as opposed to doing a full mineral appraisal on those. If it's a group, if it's an aggregated group of assets, it's better to do a reserve report than a full appraisal because you don't want to go in depth on the geology on every one of those parcels for each of those ownerships.
Understood. Very good. Okay,
Should we,
Kimberly. Yeah,
okay,
we don't have any more questions in the chat, so if you'd like to move on, feel free.
let's roll on. Now we get all of the fun maps and B pictures. So let's go over the data in the basin next. First, I want to talk about what's publicly available. What I'm going to show you guys is all public data. And a lot of professionals up here in the basin don't realize we can access this information. So we have 3 primary states in the unconventional development. It's the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the PA Department of Environmental Protection, and the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. You'll probably hear me refer to them as the DEP as a whole. Operators are required to submit a lot of documentation to the state, a lot of notifications during development. The primary ones are their permit applications. We watch those closely to see where operators are going. A post-drilling well record that tells us about the shape of that horizontal, what type of casing was put in, the depths, how long the lateral is, and helps us really see where that wellbore contacted, which parcels that wellbore contacted. We also receive a post-completion well record. It tells us how that well was completed, what size frac was done, and various engineering parameters that typically help us forecast production. And then production data. Production data is key, but it varies significantly between states. And I will say that all of these reports have different deadlines and timelines with each of the states, and each of the states posts them publicly on different timelines. So that's fun. That's fun when we're working in 3 states. I will say that production is the one that is most difficult to aggregate and normalize from an engineering perspective. Ohio reports quarterly, but the data they provide is quarterly. So as an engineer, I really don't like that. I like monthly data when it comes publicly. So if you'll always know you're looking at a well in Ohio if the public data is like very stair-steppy because it's a quarterly number. Pennsylvania is great. They do monthly data, reported monthly. So that usually only runs a few months behind in public sources. West Virginia is interesting. It is monthly data, but in 2016, they changed the reporting requirements and the permitting for horizontal wells. So all wells past 2016, you report quarterly for monthly data. But about a third of the production in West Virginia is pre-2016, sorry, about a quarter is pre-2016. That data is monthly data, but it's only produced or reported annually. So for example, any well in West Virginia that was drilled and produced or permitted prior to 2016, we don't have the 2024 production data yet because West Virginia doesn't typically publish it until sometime in the midsummer. So we run pretty far behind on West Virginia production for some of the older wells. All right, trying not to be salesy, but I want you guys to know where this data is coming from that I'm about to show you. Last year, Tim Knobloch with JKPC retired, and my team hired some of his engineers and acquired the database. And it is the database, the Appalachian Basin Horizontal Well Database, is a compilation of all of the public data from the 3 states. And we use it for our internal work, and we also provide that aggregated data to subscribers on a monthly basis. And that is a cost product, but we work in that product every day, and we provide volume forecasts, EURs, estimate ultimate recoveries, shapefiles, etc. So that is where this data is coming from. I did want to let you guys know that we have a free newsletter called the Basin Digest, and we monthly send this out to our subscribers. And it tells you about the permitting activity that's going on, a specific region we're going to focus on, some general stuff on pricing, activity levels, operators, and you can sign up for that at basindb.com. And that is a free newsletter, and it is what we as engineers think is interesting in the data coming out for the local 3 states. It's similar data that you would see in other big data products, but we're much less expensive, and we are using the data, so we're fixing a lot of things in there that some of the services not based up here don't really care about. So that's my data sourcing is all of my team of engineers and the interns that we get from the local universities every summer to help type in all of those completion records. All right, so I'm going to show you guys a bunch of maps here and some bar charts, pie charts, I'm keeping this high level. We're looking at the top level of the basin. If we're doing a type well for an undeveloped study, we'll zoom in real far and look at all the individual well sticks and tease this data out and do a bunch of fun engineering stuff. But right now I'm going to give you guys a high level overview. So every dot on this large map here represents a well that has been permitted through producing or is currently shut in the entire basin. Red is producing wells. Orange is your permitted wells, and then everything in between based on the states. So you see the Northeast cluster, and then you see the Southwestern Pennsylvania, West Virginia cluster, and then the Ohio cluster of the Utica. So this is everything from the start of the unconventional development in the basin. We did remove expired permits, so there are 530 active permits. All right, now I colored this map for you guys by formation. I find it interesting that we're now up to 20% of the wells in the basin are drilled in the Utica. So the Utica sticks are colored yellow, the Marcellus is red, and the Burkett is blue. You can see the distribution of the states down here in this chart. So Ohio is 99% Utica development. There are some Marcellus wells right on crossing the border we've seen recently. So we're watching that closely. And then Pennsylvania, you're mostly in the core Marcellus. West Virginia is also core Marcellus with a little bit of Burkett and Utica exploration going on. All right, now I wanted to talk about fluid type because that's very important to us engineers and to the economics of the wells. So you guys already know northeastern Pennsylvania is dry gas. That's going to be this red color. So, you know, more than 50% of the basin is in the dry gas window. We call this, you will hear engineers call this the maturity of the hydrocarbon. So basically everything to the east was buried deeper and cooked hotter with in geologic time. And so the further you go to the northwest, the less mature you're getting in both the Marcellus and the Utica. And that stack is relative. So the Utica is deeper. So its dry wet line is further to the west. And the Burkett is shallower, or the Geneseo. I call it the Burkett. It's a little shallower, so its maturity line's a little bit farther to the east than the Marcellus. I'm showing the Marcellus here. So you can really see the wet gas wells coming here through Butler County, Panhandle of Northern West Virginia, and then Antero land down here in West Virginia. And then your more condensate heavy wells are really the Panhandle of West Virginia. 15,000 wells, find that rather impressive for industry. All right, I did want to show you guys the Burkett Shale. It was real hot in 2014-15. We thought this was the next Marcellus. It's not as consistent across the basin. There is some exploration up here in northeastern Pennsylvania. The primary development here is Lola and Penn Energy and would have been Rex Energy back in the day. And then EQT pretty much did all of this development down here. As I said, the Burkett's maturity window is a little bit shifted east from the Marcellus, but you can see we're talking in the hundreds of wells here. We're talking 300 wells as opposed to the 15,000 Marcellus wells. So it is a secondary play. I get asked a lot why it's not developed. The further west you go, the thinner both the Marcellus and the Burkett become, and the thinner the beds in between them become. So, and then as you move towards northeastern Pennsylvania, they're further apart. They're separate plays. So really in southwestern Pennsylvania, you have to develop the Marcellus and the Burkett at the same time, or you won't have any production from the Burkett. The Marcellus really, development there, fracs there grow up into the Burkett, may or may not be draining that gas, but it makes it very hard to go back and drill a Burkett well and for the fracs to adequately work in that zone. So I'll leave that topic there for you guys, but it is hard to develop the Burkett once the Marcellus has been developed. All right, the Utica. I got two slides for the Utica for you guys. This is the whole basin. I want to point out here that we've got a big cluster of dry gas Utica developing up here in central PA. This is primarily Seneca, JKLM, and Seneca up here. somebody's exploring out this way. So this is dry, deep Utica. And then we've got your dry exploration here of range and EQT. CNX is hanging out here in Westmoreland County. And then you've got the Ohio, the primary Ohio play. So you'll see that there's actually more dry gas wells than condensate or wet gas in the Utica at this point, and there's 4,000 wells. So it's definitely developing strongly. And here's a zoom in of Ohio. You can clearly see those maturity bands, the dry gas on the counties bordering West Virginia, the thin wet gas window, and then the condensate window. Some of these wells on the outskirts are starting to be categorized as volatile oil. So that's where the exploration is going on right now. All right, I want to show you cumulative production. Now, there's two different ways to look at the production totals of wells. It's the EUR, estimated ultimate recovery. That's what we engineers think the well will produce over its entire life. And then there's cumulative production to date. Cumulative production to date can be helpful to show you where hotspots were or are currently. But you have to be careful because cumulative is on a bubble map like this. Cumulative is subject to how old the well is, how long the well is, and both of those items can throw off your comparison to others, but it's generally good to show you where the major gas production is. So again, a longer well is going to have more gas, an older well could potentially have more gas. So you've got your big gas wells up here, northeastern Pennsylvania, some big ones in Greene and Washington, and then your big, strong Utica wells. Again, this isn't normalized to compare lateral length or age. And then you can see to date that we have produced a lot of gas in this basin. And we are probably not at our peak. Again, I'm missing data in 2024 because of West Virginia. And we just started getting records in 2025. So 2023 and 2024 production are probably very close to one another. All right, same deal here with oil production. It's cumulative. It's not normalized or what we think might be the total production, so it doesn't represent value. But you can see the Marcellus trend here with the oil production bubbles really strong here along the West Virginia-Pennsylvania border in the Panhandle. And then your big emerging oil play here on the westernmost side of the Ohio Utica play. And again, 2024, we're missing data in West Virginia, but it is our peak oil to date. So we are still ramping up oil production, and that's been really fun to see as different operators are exploring that western edge. All right, here's your operator map. I apologize for all the colors, but there are approximately 54 off the top of my head operators with a significant well count in the basin. Over here, we have our list of top operators by well count, and this is just producing wells. The last couple of slides, I filtered out any wells that were permitted or in some phase of development. So you can see EQT still has the most wells, and then Expand, which is CNX plus Chesapeake, that their second most wells, pretty close there, a couple hundred between each other. Range, Antero, Katera, Seneca, Encino. So the little diamonds are Utica wells, the circles are the Marcellus wells, and you can see the concentration of operators everywhere. I'm sure you guys have seen similar maps like this before. I didn't want to dwell on it too long, but it is fun to see operators concentrated place compared to one another. All right, development pace. This is interesting for our conversation at the end. This waterfall chart over here, so each bar going down is a year and the number of wells that were brought onto production. Till means turn in line. So this is the number of wells that were brought in production by year. You can see we're up to roughly 20,000 wells. Again, we're a little behind in 24 and 25 on reporting data. So you'll see this is the same chart turned on its side, colored by state. So our peak of permitting was in 2013, and our peak of wells coming online was a little bit behind that here in the 2015, 2016, probably 2015, sorry. So this is production dates, this is permitting. It usually runs behind about a year. 2024, we're behind on our permits coming in. The states can get really far behind. So I don't think we definitely were not this low in 24. But 2023 was significantly down from 22. That may just mean that operators are not permitting as far in advance, or they had a backlog of permits. Most states you can, in most states, your permits are good for 2 years and you can renew them. So I don't get too worked up if the permitting numbers are low. And then a lot in 2013 and 14, a lot of that was aspirational development that never panned out and those permits expired. All right, now to the fun, nerdy engineering stuff. So I've got a slide on drilling and a slide on completions. Up here at the top, this is our primary drilling rig, so your horizontal rig primarily that was reported to the state. And then it's colored by the region. So Patterson really has the corner on the market up here, with Precision, Nomac, and H&P and Neighbors being the other 4 main ones that are still drilling actively up here. And then this table at the bottom I thought was pretty fun. This is drilling statistics. So this is the total footage this company has drilled, and this is original operator. So you'll notice like Cabot is still the name up here. So this is the original operator, not who owns it now. And so it's the total footage that they've drilled, surface and lateral. And then the longest drilled length is the total from the surface to lateral. So this is not lateral length. But I think this is pretty fun here to see, you know, one, the history of the basin, if you've been around a while, to see that certain people like Eclipse still have some of the longest laterals that have been drilled up here. And they've been gone quite a while, but seeing that Chesapeake has drilled the most total footage. Yeah, so this is a fun one to kind of look at and see trends. And then one that we really like and that we use a lot in our analytics is the footage per year. So we're seeing each of these lines is a different formation. So the Marcellus is this lighter green, the Utica is this blue. With time, we're seeing the average footage for a lateral increasing. So our Utica wells are generally longer. Our Marcellus are a little shorter. That's mostly geology related. The geology is really tame in Ohio compared to most of the Marcellus development. And you landmen probably have some comments on how much easier it is to put units together in Ohio versus other states, but pretty significant difference in the average drilled lateral. Then similar situation here, this is for completions. So this is representing just the lateral length here. We'll start over here with the frac spreads. Halliburton's the main frac spread in the basin, and then Universal, which is now combined with Nextier. That's your second biggest player up here. A lot of these other ones don't exist or have been absorbed into Nextier or Profac. And then same chart down here at the bottom to see completed length. This is again just the horizontal toe perf to heel perf, that distance. So these are 2 different statistics that operators will tout. They'll say we've drilled the longest lateral, or we have you know, the most lateral footage in 24 hours or something. And then you'll also hear them say this is the longest producing lateral. So there is a good difference in those 2 numbers. So we're seeing almost 4.5, 5 mile long completed laterals here. And on that topic, we have seen about a half a dozen U-turn wells, the horseshoes, where they're going down, going out, making a turn and coming back to either not have to drill 2 top holes or avoid some type of interesting land situation. We have about a half a dozen of those up here in the basin. Jury's still out on production. We don't have quite enough data yet. But same trend as in the Marcellus, the Utica wells completed length are averaging almost 15,000 feet, as is the Marcellus. So that is good. All right, and on to completions design. This is what us engineers love to look at. So the primary 3 engineering parameters that we like to go over as engineers is what is your stage length, what is your sand loading, and how much water are you using to move that sand and frac that well. So this graph up here is fun. It shows stage length with time versus stage count. So stage count's going up for 2 reasons. One, the stages are getting smaller. For the same length of well, you're having more stages, and the laterals are getting longer. So on average, you're seeing 65 stages a well in 24, and you're seeing roughly a 200-foot stage length. We've been pretty consistent at the 200-foot stage length for a long time. Once we figured out, this 500-foot range was common before 14. And then since about 2016, 17, the industry's been using a 200-foot-ish stage length. And then our lateral lengths just keep increasing. And then on the sand here, a lot of wells were completed early on, below 1,500 pounds per foot. A modern day completion is going to be up here in the above 2,000 pounds per foot in both the Marcellus and Utica. Generally, we see sand loading more than 2,500 in the Utica. Different rock mechanics is a different formation. I could go to lunch someday and talk all about how we come up with how much sand or water. Water is interesting in that it hasn't changed as much with time. There's a lot of discussion on how much water you put away based on your sand. Do you want more sand, less water, more water to touch more rock, etc. I'll just leave this with you now since we're running out of time. All right, 2 more big slides here with engineering stuff. So this is a bubble map like we looked at before with the cumulative production, except for this is reserves. So what this does is this normalizes the well by lateral length. So this is comparative by well and is including a forecast. So this is saying from day 1 of production through its 30 to 50 years of productive life, this is how much gas we think this well will recover. And then we divide that by lateral length so that we can compare apples to apples across the basin. You'll see, again, really big wells up here. And again, some here, less of an impact on the Utica when you start normalizing to EUR. And a lot of that is because the Utica wells come in with a very strong IP and then they decline very quickly, as opposed to the Marcellus, not quite as high of an IP, but a more shallow decline. And this is our average EUR per 1,000 foot. And this is a histogram. If the histogram is log normal, meaning it's shifted to the left, that means we have an accurate representation of a natural system. So this is really high quality data. Our average in the basin today is 1.75. Generally, if an operator sees above a 2, they're going to develop that all day. That's roughly where the economics mark plays if it's a dry gas well. Same for oil. We're seeing this big emerging oil play over here. Some of these bubbles maybe are a data problem, but we've got real strong oil over here. Again, this is reserves, not cumulative production. All right, we have 3 minutes for any questions on all of this data. If you guys want to stay long, we can definitely stay long and chat some more. So if you have any questions on this, if you could pop it in the chat.
Thank you, Kimberly. There's currently no questions, but feel free to ask, or attendees feel free to ask. But Kimberly, I wanted to ask, so you touched on a reference to volatile oil. Can you speak to the difference of volatile oil and black oil and maybe just help a landman understand
Sure.
the difference between those terms?
So black oil is going to have less off-gassing. So it's just a difference in the way the processing takes place on the surface. So as you go from dry gas to volatile oil, the more processing equipment you need as it gets to volatile oil, because volatile, as you go to, let me start back, dry gas to wet gas to condensate, the hydrocarbons are coming out of the ground as a gas, as in wet gas, and then it's the heavies are falling out on the surface because of the temperature. The condensate, they may be actual liquids in the subsurface and flow up the wellbore as a liquid. Volatile oil, they're definitely a liquid on the surface, but they're producing a lot of gas, so you have to make sure you capture that gas and handle it. Black oil is most likely just to be a liquid stream with not as much gas produced. You don't have to worry about that gas production. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Do you think from a production standpoint, is it more difficult to produce black oil because of the weight or any concern along those lines?
You're gonna have long-term operating costs with black oil wells, meaning you're gonna have plunger lift or some type of artificial lift system to keep that heavy fluid moving.
Okay.
Gas is what our reservoirs. So
understood. So I have a question. in horizontal shale wells, when we stimulate the reservoir, stimulate the well, if we think about the life cycle of this well or the maturing of a traditional or unconventional shale well, when we produce the Utica or Marcellus, what are there, can you pinpoint or can you reference a percentage of the reserves that we're producing? Is there any opportunity in 15 years for a third party, or as the well ages, someone else to come back in and re-stimulate the well bore or refrac to produce any uncaptured reserves at that point? Or can you speak on that?
Yeah, the industry as a whole right now doesn't think that refracs on gas wells are going to be economic. Just because of the size of that gas molecule and how it flows. We are seeing successful refracs in oil wells because of the way that molecule flows through the rock and how we have to contact it with the frac. You're more likely to be able to go back in an oil well, perf some new holes, and create a new stimulation and access new rock. Gas moves much more freely. So we don't think so from a refrac standpoint. However, I will say there are opportunities late in the life of the well to help the wells along. That is plunger lift, other artificial lift methods. That's soaping the wells to help on the production side. That's lowering your line pressure with compression. There's other techniques, changing your tubing size, lowering your tubing. There's various production engineering techniques we can increase the life of the well and bring shut-in wells back to life, if you want to call it that. But refracs are unlikely in the gas, is my view currently.
Okay, no, very good. Well, I don't have any other questions. There are none in the chat, so
All
if you'd
right,
like to move
last
on, that'd be
section.
great.
This is where I was hoping to have a little conversation. I know I'm over time, so I won't be offended if people have to drop off. But I wanted to talk about development planning. This is something I love helping operators do. And it's something that you as landman are probably very interested in because you're like, why are we leasing here? Why did the operator not drill this area we worked really hard on to get all secured? Or when are my minerals that I'm involved in going to be developed? So I wanted to talk about first who is generally on a development team at an operator. Generally that team is not just engineers. It's a team of core leaders or planners in the company that are really making sure that the development plan is meeting the company's strategic plan and their purpose outlined by their shareholders, if they're public, or their stakeholders if they're private. So generally you're going to have some type of team leader, whether that's a CEO or an asset manager, or you're going to see, yes, that, and you're going to see a land manager or someone that's familiar with the general area and lease terms, expirations, they can provide the mapping to that. You're going to see a reservoir engineer for sure, because that's the person that's going to run the numbers at the end. You're definitely going to have a geologist if it's an early play, or a geophysicist. That person's optional if it's really well understood play, or you're not exploring. You'll probably have an operations engineer on the team that can speak to the costs of constructing the pad sites, the drilling, completions, production facilities. Then you'll also have a commercial person on that team that's going to help you understand the development cost, or the commodity pricing, and the different contracts and anything that might affect your midstream. So that's usually the team. And then the reservoir engineers in the middle trying to get all the notes, ask all the questions, and then go run the model and come back with the team. Usually these are iterative planning processes. So this is the only slide I have because I was hoping to be interactive with you guys. But these are just some of the considerations that we take into account when we're talking development. And some of them might be surprising to non-engineers. I think commodity pricing is the one that's talked about in the industry all the time. Up here, you may be less suspect to watching the oil price every day because our basin is really controlled by our midstream constraints, and operators are drilling to backfill their pipelines. So we're less sensitive to gas and oil prices here in our basin than other basins in the US. We've reached a pretty steady state of pace since the mid 2020s, post the low point of COVID, we've really been pretty steady. However, you'll see some variation in rigs and spread pricing. So I see some of the smaller players jumping in when they see overall markets a little bit cheaper. So they might just grab a top hole rig, or they might hold some wells off and then just frack them when the frack spread price is a couple $1,000s less a stage. So I do see some opportunistic development. And typically if your land position you're looking at or the asset you're evaluating is controlled by a smaller operator, you might see more erratic development patterns based on sensitivity to development costs, like the rig costs, for example. You guys know about the consideration when it comes to land. So expirations are a consideration, but they're not always the main consideration. Forced pooling, now we have that in West Virginia. So we're seeing some added development in West Virginia that seemed to be unattainable in the past. So that's been interesting to watch. And then the big one in West Virginia, northeastern Pennsylvania, surface access. Sometimes the mountains are very large and it's very difficult to get today's modern frac and drilling equipment into these locations and build a pad that's large enough and does meet all of the environmental requirements, especially in PA for water runoff and holding ponds. So when I'm on a development team, I almost always have a civil engineer or someone that is very versed in building those pads, because we can do all the planning we want with the land team and the geologist. If we can't get there on the surface and have a landman to go out and negotiate that agreement to build a pad, we're stuck. So I always like to have that from the start laid out. Let's make sure that we're just not making up things here. I'm sure you guys have ran into this before, but I've ran in certain cases in deals where we're looking at assets to purchase for certain operators. And in the deal package, the reservoir engineer forgot to turn on the satellite imagery when they laid out all of the sticks in the pad locations. And this has happened half a dozen times where a pad location is sitting on the middle of an interstate exchange because the reservoir engineer just sees a blank spot with no parcels, or it seems flat on the topo map, and oh, this is a great spot for a pad, and never turns on the satellite imagery. So always make sure as a land team, if you're on an A&D team, turn on the satellites on your map and make sure that all the pad locations are actually achievable. So financial, these also are probably pretty understandable from you guys, annual budgets, but capital concentration is a unique one. I'm seeing this more often when companies are leaning heavily on leverage to do some of their drilling plans, if they've got an RPL or some other type of lending facility that they're drilling with. Sometimes the banks don't want to see all your eggs in one basket. So they don't like it if you have $10 million wells on the same pad. They could potentially all go offline at the same time if you have a midstream problem. I think our case in point might be Edgemark Energy in 2018 that ended up in bankruptcy because of the ETP issue on their pipeline. So capital concentration is a concern because logically you would think operators would want to just have a core area, get those efficiencies from scale, but that's not always the case depending on how they're managing their finances. Annual budget seems obvious, but sometimes I see operators playing the swings on frac spreads and or gas prices with their annual budget. So instead of just saying I have X amount of dollars to spend this year on drilling, they will not keep that consistent across the year. Most of the big operators do, but smaller operators may say I'm going to target drilling in the summer, so I frack in the fall so that I turn my wells on when prices locally are the highest in December and January or February, March. So you'll see that budget playing with the commodity pricing. And then also sometimes operators are drilling just to meet their hedge book obligations or to structure that in a different way. And then the fun part for me is the operations and engineering. We talked about the generational effects. So I mentioned outspacing. That will change how you put your sticks on the map, how many sticks you have on the map. Reservoir drainages are well spacing. That changes with price deck, believe it or not, because that's a function of net present value. So if I drill wells closer together, I'm gonna get that gas out sooner. And if I put a heavier frac, I'm gonna get that gas out sooner. If I'm spending more money, I'm drilling more wells. If prices are lower, you'll see operators start spacing their wells out if they can. And maybe putting a smaller frac on it. So it's a balancing act between the capital you're putting in the ground and the number of sticks you're getting per acre, or sorry, per mile or per section. Again, capacity midstream constraints. I also see midstream issues in Pennsylvania quite frequently. If you cross or interact with too many wetlands, you get put in a different regulatory bucket that can take significantly more time to get approved for your midstream. So that's also a consideration. And then minimum volume commitments are starting to come into play in Appalachia. A lot of operators did deals with their midstream counterparts early on to commit to a minimum volume through that pipeline for an extended period of time so that the midstream company would build those pipes. As the wells are declining and operational development has slowed, you're starting to see fees come into effect that are really hurting the balance sheet of a lot of companies. So they are drilling because one, it's helpful, but two, they're not only getting the cash flow from that individual well, they're offsetting a potential fee for not selling enough gas through that pipeline. So that's kind of a unique one. And every operator is balancing a different priority, whether that be arresting their natural decline, keeping their production level flat, whether that be meeting their MVCs, whether that be staving off expirations for a land position they spend a lot of money to put together. There's a whole lot of things that each of the teams thinks that their area is most important. So that asset manager really has to balance all of those concerns and make sure that that development plan, that timing, those sticks are really answering the company and stakeholders' objectives. All right, so that is what I have for you guys. Anyone have questions on development planning or the presentation in general? I think we can turn the mutes off, or people can ask to be unmuted now. Saw some hands and some thumbs up during that section. Somebody was interacting. Wow, I thought you guys would really want to talk about this section.
Abby, oh no, Abby, can you unmute everybody?
They should have the capability of unmuting themselves right now.
Okay, very good.
Uh-huh.
So Kimberly, I have a question. So you mentioned commodity prices throughout your presentation. Are there any what index or source do you use to or would you suggest we use as Landmen when we refer to commodity prices for the most accurate
I
figure?
mean, you see Henry Hub, NYMEX, WTI out there all the time. It's a pretty safe bet to just use NYMEX less $1. That's really safe. Local basis are DOM South, you'll see DOMS. So that's Dominion South and DTI. Those are the two kind of Southwestern Pennsylvania indexes that you can get access to. But generally just everyday numbers that you can get like stock ticker information from. I just say Henry Hub less $1. In the winter, sometimes we will be less 75 cents, but very rarely does it move off of that these days unless something funky is going on.
Yeah. Okay. And then do you have any publications or resources? I know what you're probably reading is different than what Landmen read, but do you have any suggestions to good resources or good information, whether online or through print publication, that you would suggest that'd be beneficial for Landmen to read?
That's interesting from an engineering perspective. Yes, I follow a lot of journals. They're very nerdy and in the weeds on completions methods and reserve methods and stuff. I have to think about that, but I do know in Veris and some of the other big data services, Novi is another one. They do posts on their LinkedIn pages quite frequently that show trends and development trends in production, engineering stuff. Most of those are going to be national and not regional specific. I'm not aware of one other than our newsletter that's region specific. And then for pricing and commodity trends, I really like Aegis. They have a quarterly webinar they host, and they're a hedging assisting company. I really like their market outlook and where they think about prices. They do a really good job at sharing that with the industry. And that's quarterly, and it's Aegis, it's AEGIS. I like that one.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. You know, one thing on your presentation with the bar graphs, I noticed that there was a downward trend on, I think it was permit activity since maybe 2010 or 2011 or so. But then I noticed, yeah, so, but what I noticed in 2020, we had 718 in each year, maybe a 5 to 7% increase, give or take. And then a decline here in 2023. So I know this may be a difficult question, but when we look at the life of the basin and undeveloped reserves, do you have any insight or thoughts on lifespan, where we're at in the maturing of our play, and what the future holds and what the
Sure.
outlook is?
I am maybe a bit of an optimist when it comes to being a reservoir engineer. Most reservoir engineers are rain clouds. So I have to curb my enthusiasm quite frequently, but I think we're in a good place in this basin and there's a lot more to come. The permitting is interesting because permitting is by well, and our wells are more than double the length. So you would expect the number of permits out there to be half of what was going on in 2013, because we're drilling more with less rigs. We're producing more gas with less wells. So that's a function of that. It doesn't necessarily mean there's less activity here because there's less permits. That's why permitting is a touchy one. It is really it's a result of the lateral length, and then operators are also holding permits in reserve with renewals. So it's hard to tell year over year how many are still out there and not expired, because expirations and renewals are really hard to track from the public data. And then I will say probably switching in 2023, we started seeing mergers and acquisitions being the main play in the basin, where there have been some big transactions and mergers and companies just selling out. So that has been more of the focus than really pushing the envelope and exploring. I will say the Utica dry gas window, I think from an engineering standpoint, we haven't 100% figured out the deep dry Utica. It's still very expensive, so I think that play is still wide open, and I love where we're seeing in the Ohio Utica window. That is definitely there has been a technology discovery over there that's opening up that window. We knew the rock was there, we knew the oil was there, we just didn't know how to effectively frack it and land those wells, and that code's been cracked. So I see development over there happening pretty rapidly. And the restrictor on that development is going to be oil processing and midstream capabilities. So lots of oil coming on and nowhere to go with it.
Right. No, that's great feedback. We do have a question from Carrie. So when valuing a potential mineral sale, how are you advising sellers when it comes to PPC sensitivities across NGLs, condensate, and dry gas?
Sure. Well, it's pretty obvious if you don't have post-production costs, that lease is much more valuable. We see that impacting, the impact is higher the wetter your well is. In general, it costs more to operate a wet well than it does a dry gas well, because of all of the different equipment on site. So dry gas well, it would be a smaller percentage effect for post-production costs. And then, again, wet gas, it's more. And we can see that up to 15 or 20% in the NGL condensate window. So if I'm advising a seller or someone who's leasing, which we don't do a lot if we're valuing. I can't really cross the advising versus valuing side. But if I were to advise, I generally say I would take less points on the lease and not have post-production costs. Does that answer your question, Carrie? I see you're unmuted.
Yes, it does. Yeah, just kind of a generalized question for the group. Obviously, NGLs are very expensive to process. Just kind of wanted to toss that out there.
Yes, you got it. It kind of relates to the volatile oil and the black oil conversation. If we get all the way to black oil, which I'm not sure we will in the Utica because black oil is hard to move, you'll see that cost go down. But I don't think we'll get that far. So as you get wetter, the costs are higher.
Very good. Are there any other questions for Kimberly? Well, Kimberly, thank you very much for your time. This was a great presentation.
Hope you guys enjoyed it. Feel free to sign up for our newsletter. Again, it's for free. We just like sharing data. If you have questions, reach out. I can obviously talk about a lot of different things. I like talking. So yeah, reach out at any time, and thank you for the invitation. It was fun.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you everybody for attending. This will conclude our presentation and lunch and learn today. So thank you very much, and thank you again, Kimberly.
Thanks. All right, bye.
Bye.